Morning, everyone. My name is Johanna Massis. I will be your host today for today's Restorative Justice panel, offered by Temescal Associates. I have been a practitioner in the out-of-school time field for a little over 20 years now. Been fortunate enough to find my calling in working with young people in a lot of different capacities. But after school is where my heart lives and where I breathe and where I thrive. I really do enjoy it. I have been in Oakland for about 10 years now and was formally introduced to what is restorative justice then. Prior to that, I think it was a lot of trauma-informed practices before trauma-informed was a buzzword, but it was definitely embedded practices in how we served our young people. So excited to have been introduced to restorative justice, and in my former organization, Oakland Leaf, was able to implement so that all of our after-school sites had a restorative justice coordinator and facilitator, had a cohort to best support them in their practice, obviously helping them work through the things that they were going through as an adult so that they could be at best service for our young people. I'm currently the Director of Program Quality Training and Assessment at Girls Inc. of Alameda County. So still here in Oakland and continuing to support the adult staff in their process and their learning around these practices. So excited to have you all here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and wanted to let you know before we start, we know restorative justice can be valuable and an effective approach in after-school youth programs for addressing conflicts and behavioral issues among young participants. By incorporating restorative justice principles into these programs, facilitators and staff can create a supportive and inclusive environment that encourages positive behavior, builds stronger relationships, and fosters personal growth. This webinar will feature after-school practitioners who have successfully integrated restorative justice practices into their programs. We'll also feature restorative justice experts on why it is important for youth, share available curriculum and materials, and how to get started using restorative justice practices in after-school programs. Feel free to enter any of your questions or comments into the chat box. And if you didn't hear earlier, we will have time at the end for Q&A. Right. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Nellie Bisram, who is Professional Development Specialist with Palm Beach Prime Time. Nellie Bisram joins Prime Time with more than 19 years experience as a social sciences professor, trainer and consultant in program curriculum design, professional development, grant writing, and economic development. A community advocate for mental health, Nellie currently serves as co-chair of the Mind-Body Resilience Coalition, a subcommittee of the Children's Services Council of Broward County, and a founding member of Broward County's Public Schools Superintendent Mindfulness Initiative. Welcome, Nellie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Nellie, share with us what forms of restorative justice take place in the programs that you work in.
So I just want to back up and just share that Prime Time, the organization that I work with, is actually an out-of-school time intermediary. There's a slide there with just the services that we provide. So we work with over 150 out-of-school time programs, providing a quality improvement system. And embedded in that system are practices that build community, that build positive relationships, and I guess in a lighter sense, do help to build, to create the foundation for restorative practice. And the main ways in which we integrate restorative justice and restorative practice in general in after school is through our professional learning and coaching pathways. And through all of the main offerings, whether it's through training, coaching, or even our partnerships with expanded learning opportunity providers. So, you know, I want to also kind of ground us, because I feel like we're jumping into this conversation about restorative practice. And as a mindfulness teacher, And as someone who, and even at prime time, we really focus on the embodiment of the work. And so I want to invite, and you can pause the screen for a moment. I want to invite folks into a couple practices that whether or not you are at the point where you could successfully implement a restorative justice circle, or if you're just starting off as a practice that you can take away with you. And so what we've implemented at prime time, both for our staff and we try to implement with our after school programs, is a practice called, it's called by many names, but I call it the power pause. And so I invite folks to just, wherever you are, to just take a moment to notice your body, to feel your feet on the ground. Some people like to close their eyes. Some people like to just keep their eyes open. And if that's you, you can just gaze downward. But just for a moment, let go of any activity that you might be engaged in, outwardly and inwardly. And take a moment to let your heart, your mind, and your body enter this moment. And so you might feel your feet. You might have a sense of how your body is seated, if sitting on a chair. And taking a moment now to notice the breath. You might be aware of thoughts coming and going. You might be aware of emotions or anything else that's present in your internal landscape. And so we can use our breath, or we can use the sensation in our feet or in our hands as a way to reconnect to ourselves and to this moment and to everyone that's here with us. So the foundation for restoring connection is being present. And so as we transition out of this practice, I invite you to transition in your own way, wiggle your fingers and your toes, open your eyes if they were closed. And I'll keep going, but I invite you to share in the chat box an emoji or just a word or a phrase that's present, that represents what's present for you right now as we enter this session together. And I'd also like to share, and we can put the next slide up, Johanna, with the circle agreement. So this is another practice, and there are variations of this, but one of the practices that we try to embody as individuals, previous slide, as individuals working with young people and as adults, really trying to embody and model this so that it's internalized as we work with other adults serving youth and with youth, is to establish the practice of having community agreements, shared agreements, or what we call circle agreements. So I'm just going to share 4 that you may want to take with you, or that even us speakers, we might want to. I certainly need to remember them. And that is to speak from the heart, speak your truth from the heart. Listen from the heart. And so when someone is speaking, to really listen with full attention, with non-judgment, and with an open and curious attitude. To respect whatever the sharing protocol is. We're not using a talking piece today, but we have definitely will have some kind of protocol for sharing. And to be lean on speech. So say enough, not too much. Just noticing what's arising naturally and allow that to listening to the sound of your own voice, and also knowing when to stop, to leave space for others. So those are 2 practices that I hope that you can take with you. And so the rest of what I'd like to share is really just a few things. One is, and you can go to the next slide. So one is that, you know, the way that we think about restorative practice at prime time is really tapping into the power of circle. And so we have been really trying to, whether it's to all of our after school programs that are in our community that we serve, really offering training. We have a training called the Power of Circle that actually taps into what happens when you focus on creating a restorative structure, building that restorative structure into your programs. There's some things that can happen quite naturally, and that make it easier to build in some of the other principles of trust and interdependence, and just a culture of community well-being, nonviolence, and youth voice. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned before, we try to embody this work by walking the talk ourselves. And so there are certain practices within our staff. And so I'm mentioning this because I really think that for those of us that are looking at deepening our restorative practice as we serve others, that there's always an inward kind of look and walk that we have to take. And so we're still on that journey. We're new to that journey in the last 5 years that I've been a part of Prime Time. And that's a journey of recognizing that communities, whether it's a family or an after-school program or an organization, are and can be ecosystems of care, well-being, and healing, self-healing, healing on an individual and on a collective level. And so putting in, integrating practices that allow that to happen, whether it's through certain rituals, whether it's just sitting in a circle when we're in person, or having equity of voice. And so I mentioned that we do offer training pathways, which I'll get into a little bit more in the next slide, that, so there are training pathways that allow after-school programs to kind of dip their toes in, to understand what the power of circle is and the different ways that it can be implemented. And then we have very kind of specific cohort pathways, what we used to call the Social Emotional Learning Initiative, and that's now called the Wellbeing and Life Skills Initiative. And I would also say our Teen Advisory Council, and I see our middle school specialist, Anton Spalding, is here. So he's the person you can talk to about that. That there are pathways that offer kind of a more intensive dive into how do you take the community building benefit of circles and of restorative practice and of responsive and inclusive practices. How do you go on a journey of building relationship of trust to having a trauma-informed healing space where we can learn practices and use them for personal well-being and for collective well-being? And then how can we use that foundation for problem solving and for resolution of conflict? And so through the Teen Advisory Council, where youth actually have the opportunity to lead meetings and to do mindfulness practices and to take this into their own lives, and also the after school programs that we implement something called the afternoon meeting with explicit instruction in these skills. And then on the community level, we try as an organization that is a part of a larger community of youth serving organizations to be a partner in having community conversations and integrating these practices in events. So next slide. And so this is just a visual of the continuum of restorative practice that I mentioned, kind of like different tiers of how we begin to kind of embody circle and how we begin to embody various practices like using positive language, nonviolent communication, to build community. And so you see some examples there that I've mentioned before. And then, so this kind of just shows the arc of how we build that foundation, whether we're talking about specific programs or across the board or at the community level or in our teams. And so the practice, the power pause practice and the shared agreements practice are two kind of signature or concrete practices that are embedded across this continuum. You know, and I'd like to say a little bit more. I mentioned the afternoon meeting, the well-being and life skills cohorts, and the teen advisory cohorts. But we, in the last 3 years, implemented a restorative practice series that's a pathway with coaching and implementation support. So it's a 4-part series. And I have some handouts where I can share, you know, some more information on that. And so after school practitioners go through this cohort, and the culmination of this is to establish restorative conferences. And so we've had 3 or 4 iterations of this. It's not perfect, but this is something that we created. We created our own curriculum and our own training, but it's based on the work of the International Institute of Restorative Practices. And so, next slide. And so, you know, kind of going back to, you know, some of the takeaways that we can provide, and I can probably just share the handouts in the chat box, but there's a couple of trainings that we offer on the main calendar that are available to all in our community. But if you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me. My contact is on the next slide. And so I'll be sharing in the chat the handout on how you can build shared agreements or circle agreements. It's just a lesson plan that's openly available. And then also I will share a PDF of my slides specifically for anyone who's interested. And I'm just now seeing some of the comments in the chat. Thank you for those of you that shared what you noticed when we did the power pause: open, focused, aware, present, situated. And so the intention is for us to start our interactions that way and to end our interactions that way. Because without presence and awareness, there's really, we're all kind of coming in not knowing how we're meeting each other in this moment. And so that's kind of the foundation for all of our practices. So do you have any questions? And Johanna, I don't know if there was something specific you wanted me to mention as within the context of the webinar, but I can certainly answer later on.
Of course. No, that was wonderful. First, thank you for grounding us and holding us in the presence of this, and also for sharing what it is that you do over in Palm Beach. That's wonderful, and grateful for the resources. So know that the recording will be shared, and the resources that our panelists have will be shared with you as well. So thank you, Nellie. Appreciate all of that. We can give some virtual snaps to Nellie. Thank you. All right. Our next speaker is David Usum, who is the Restorative Justice Coordinator with Oakland Unified School District. David has over 22 years of experience as a leader and practitioner in the field of conflict resolution and restorative justice. For the last 11 plus years, he has coordinated the restorative justice, or RJ movement, at Oakland Unified. The RJ program at OUSD is considered a national model for the implementation of restorative practices in schools. Prior to working at OUSD, David managed the community mediation program at Seeds and founded the Restorative Justice Program. David has also initiated RJ pilot programs at the Alameda County Juvenile Justice Center and Berkeley Unified School District. At OUSD, David supports the district-wide implementation of restorative justice practices as a model to relate, repair, and restore. David is committed to building caring, engaging, and equitable school communities and to the elimination of racial disparities in discipline. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Johanna. Great to be here. Greetings, everyone. Good morning. Nellie, it's really nice to follow your presentation. I just feel like saying, yeah, what she said, ditto to that. Thanks to Temescal Associates for asking me to be here. Yeah, I coordinate restorative justice at Oakland Unified School District. Actually, I'm going on my 13th year right now. But my background is conflict resolution, like Johanna said. So I support the district-wide implementation of restorative practices. That's during the school day and in after school. So across the district at all the schools. And so this webinar sounds like it's kind of a focus on after school. So we can talk a little bit about that if people have questions. Why don't you put up the first slide then, Johanna? I want to talk a little bit about RJ at OUSD, just so it's kind of situated for you and you kind of have an idea of what it is that we do. This is a circle of students. After the circle, this is the way they close the circle here with the thumb circle. So that's one example of how we might close a circle. You can go to the next slide. Well, so we put together these foundational principles, and these are our touchstones for when we do restorative justice. So as an RJ team at the district, we come back to these when we train people in restorative justice practices. We train on these, and I don't have the time to go through them all, but I just want you to kind of look through and see this is kind of what we marinate in, so to speak. And we want to make sure that when we do restorative justice, we're keeping these foundational principles in mind. And the thing about doing restorative justice, by the way, I use the term restorative justice and restorative practices pretty interchangeably. So if you're wondering about semantics, I use the words, they mean the same thing to me. So, but when you're doing restorative justice in an institution like public education, it can be difficult. There's a tension to keep these things, hold true to these foundational principles while being within a system, because sometimes the system, which foundation is in systems of oppression and punitive justice, it can be really hard. So it takes constant sort of vigilance to do this kind of work, and to check our own assumptions and to make sure that we're not drifting into our comfort zones as adults, but that we're keeping true to these foundational principles. And so you can go to the next slide. And the way we do restorative justice in Oakland is, as Johanna mentioned, in this sort of format of relate, repair, restore. It's these three sort of ways of looking at restorative justice within the system of public education within OUSD. And so the vast majority of our work, I would say, the goal is that, over 90% of our work is basically relate. And that's the kind of circle that you see right here in this picture. So this is a picture of one of our former high school interns named Maida doing a circle with an elementary school in East Oakland. And you can see there the circle, just like Nellie described, there's our values down there on a centerpiece. There's the courtesies or guidelines, talking pieces, elements of nature, the four elements. And most of the circles we do are these types of circles that allow us to practice our social and emotional skills, like self-awareness and social awareness and responsible decision-making, things like that, patience, empathy, and also allow us to connect with each other and feel cared for and loved and safe. And when there's safety present, that's when learning can happen. And so, and teaching, by the way, teaching and learning. And so this is mostly what we do, is these kinds of circles. They're held every day in Oakland, unified, just as a way for us to connect as a community and help shift our culture to the one that we want it to be. When you're talking about restorative justice, you don't want to restore to something that's oppressive and racist, right? You want to restore to something that's positive and caring and connected. And so we spend most of our time creating the community we want to restore to when we do need to have those conversations. And so my goal would be, if you were to ask anybody, a student, a parent, a teacher, administrator in OUSD, what is restorative justice? What does it mean to you? That they wouldn't really talk about harm or conflict so much as that they would talk about what it feels like to be connected in community, with their peers and colleagues. And so that's our focus. And when we create that foundation, then we can have those conversations about repair, about harm, about conflict. And by the way, as you'll see in a minute, we train a lot of students across our district every year to do peer restorative justice. And so many of the students are doing these circles around repair and relate. And so that might be smaller groups of people that are having some kind of conversation that they need to have to repair a harm or something, or a conflict. And then restore would be, that's kind of like individualized support. So that an example of that might be someone returning from being incarcerated into our schools, and we just want to identify what they need to be successful to, attend, achieve, and graduate. And it just makes sense. I mean, why wouldn't you welcome someone to school that's either new to the school or returning to the school from being absent for a while, and realistically offer what you can to make sure that they're successful there. And so to me, this is about being human with each other in community. That's really what it's about, and moving from what you might call like a transactional way of being to one that is relational. And that's the culture shift that we're trying to make in Oakland. So that's kind of how we look at it: relate, repair, restore. And you can go to the next slide. So in case you're wondering about how we do this, this is kind of like our organizational structure at the moment. It's been different over the years, but currently this is what it looks like. And so you'll see the way this looks is we have our site-based RJ facilitators, and I'm realizing now this is a pretty hierarchical looking thing. So it looks like I got caught up in the way we tend to talk about things hierarchically in the district, which is not typically the way I like to do things. But as I'm looking at this slide right now, I'm like, wow, look, that looks pretty hierarchical. But we are in a hierarchical system, and we are trying to do this work within that. And so, but if you see, we have site-based facilitators. So those are people, they're OUSD staff, they're at the site, at the different schools, full-time, and their job is to support the entire school in implementing restorative justice practices. It's not to do it for the school. In this country, our culture is you go to the experts for things, right? You need your taxes done, you go to your accountant. You need some therapy, you go to a therapist. But with RJ, we're trying to sort of break that professionalist mold. And what we do is we have people there, but their job is to train everyone else and support everyone else in doing this work. And sure, they're doing it too, but they're not the ones doing it solely for the school. So they're awesome folks, and they're all over our district doing this work, relate, repair, restore, all over at all of our schools. And they also support in some of our schools the after school work as well. And then we have central staff, which would be me and then Denise Curtis, who is our current program manager. And we do all the training, we do all the coaching and staff, we do direct service when there needs to be a circle or some kind of process where an RJ facilitator can't do it or a student can't do it. And then you see these bubbles there of the students, and the students, like I said, we're training students all year long to do this work and support this work and to really own it, which I love to see. It's actually the best part of my job, I think, is to go to schools and just see them, loving restorative justice, loving being circle, and maintaining fidelity to it, which they do better than adults, quite frankly. So students are sort of all over our structure, and it's also We also support students in the All City Council, which is our student governing body, to do restorative justice. And 2 of the students that are in our All City Council are also student directors on the school board. So we have that RJ support all the way up into the school board. I want to talk a little bit about peer RJ. So let's go to the next slide. Because a robust peer RJ program, I think, or I would call it actually a movement more than a program, a robust peer RJ movement, I think is vital to district-wide implementation of restorative justice practices. The key is that you're engaging youth in a way on a youth development framework that allows them to do something that they love and are passionate about. We're not trying to get youth to do the job of adults. That's important to know the difference. And youth are in our district a lot longer than most adults, 12, 13 years. And so if you're talking about sustainability, who's going to be around the longest? Well, students are. And not only can they support it as they matriculate up through TK, through graduation, they'll take it outside of school beyond, and then hopefully come back and support the work at many of our schools. And so I believe a youth movement can provide some stability and sustainability when there's so much adult churn in the district. And it does help drive adult implementation. The best practice is really changing adult behavior when we're talking about restorative justice. But I have seen youth embracing restorative justice help move the adults at many schools. And so it can help. And leadership and engagement is a beautiful thing. Like I said, youth will really, once they get what RJ really is, and they are able to participate in circles and embrace the philosophy. I've just seen them just take it and it's theirs. They don't have to wait for the expert. They don't have to wait for an adult to come do it with them. They can just do it. And I've seen that, and I think that's great. Of course, we're trying to build and maintain our community and respond to conflict and harm when it happens. I mentioned the social emotional learning, skills that are even passively learned in circle. Nellie was talking about circle. If you're just sitting in a circle having a conversation, you are receiving social and emotional learning, whether you know it or not. You have to be patient. You have to be aware of the group, you have to listen, those kinds of things. So that's why I think peer RJ is important. Let's see, I just see a couple things in the chat popping up here. Define RJ. Okay. Well, that's going to be different every time I'm asked that question. I don't have I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't have my elevator speech for RJ because I answer that question differently every time. I'd be curious to hear how other people define it. I mentioned earlier, it's about being powerful in your community. It's about being connected. It's a process for being human with each other. And it's based on ancestral and indigenous traditions that we all have in our history. Even if you don't know anything about your ancestors, they most likely practice some form of this. And so it's about being in touch with what we already know is true by being human, which is that connecting with each other is powerful, and all things lead from that. And that when you feel connected to your community, you feel responsible to it. And when you feel responsible to it, when you make a mistake, you want to make it right in some way. And so that's sort of one way to describe restorative justice. And in a school district, it's about moving that district from, like I mentioned earlier, the systems of oppression that it was born out of into something different where teaching and learning can happen. Because if a school is a community of learners, then you've got to create the community part so that the learning part can happen. It's 10:10. That's my time. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. I know as At my former organization, Oakland Leaf, we definitely used to send our RJ facilitators to the OUSD training, and I love the tiered model that you had, so that as folks were getting comfortable in the work, and also creating the boundaries with the school day, because I think that's a hard part of it too. The school day tended to see it as the end all be all and expected it, so that by the time after school was starting, everything was settled. And it was like, whoa, it's not this like one arrow in the quiver situation where it's one and done. It's like, no, this is a process. And so I appreciate both you and Ellie naming that as well. The fidelity to the practice is what makes it super important. And obviously the buy-in of our young people. And I've definitely seen young people take it, make it theirs, and even name it to the adults to be like, I saw some drama go down at recess. Can I go? Yes, please. And they would initiate that. And it was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was great to see them really step into their power and be at service to their community in that way. So thank you. So virtual snaps for David. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Victoria Gonzalez, Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the San Francisco YMCA. Victoria Gonzalez is a mother, Black woman, and the director of GDEI, a role that was created to steward YMCA's SF's global diversity, equity, and inclusion work, practices, and strategies throughout our organization. Although still somewhat new in her role, she has been involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion work previously as an administrative officer in higher education, supporting equity for students as well as longtime transformative and restorative justice practitioner. Welcome, Victoria.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, I am the Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the YMCA, but in my previous role, I was an Administrative Hearing Officer for St. Mary's College of California. In that role, where restorative justice showed up, I was trained probably about 9 years ago. I was introduced to restorative justice probably about 9 years ago, and I got introduced to it because someone, my supervisor, wanted us to use restorative justice in our hearing process for students. So the age group that I worked with were first-year students, so from 18 to 22-year-olds, and sometimes our graduate students. We didn't have an after-school program, but what we did do, and the way that it showed up and the way that I practiced it, was it showed up in our hearing process. The goal was to address the disproportionate number of Black and Brown students that came into contact with the disciplinary and our conduct offices to ensure that there was equity, to ensure that we worked toward dismantling that oppressive, very restrictive, punitive system that could actually derail completely our Black and Brown students matriculating through college and going through their career. And so the way that it showed up and the way that I engaged our community with it is I used it to disrupt the hearing process. And what that means is that instead of the student going through the disciplinary process, which is investigation, interview, you're found responsible or guilty of whatever rule that you broke. We actually had students come in and we used some of the 5 top questions from restorative justice. Was like, what happened? How are you feeling? Who was impacted? What are the things that need to make right? And so we had peer conduct hearing officers who were actually trained in restorative justice. Our resident directors, who were actually the folks that were writing up reports of misconduct, were trained in creating a restorative lens so that they could perceive what was going on and change and shift the way that they were engaging with the students that lived in residence. And so our peers learned, our peer leaders learned restorative justice practices. They went through a restorative justice 101 where they learned what it was like, what that whole process looks like. They learned principles and practices. One of the large practices, like the other panelists have mentioned, that we implemented in our community was community agreements, was community building. Because like it's been said, if you don't have that responsibility to your community and you don't have not rules, but you don't have agreements on how to be in relations to one another, you're not going to know how to be responsible to that community. And so that was some of the work that we really amplified, is that community building. The hearings also were shifted from, excuse me, some of the things that we also did were story circles. That was one of our first implementations, were story circles, so that we could build community and build an understanding of one another. And one of those were responses to, cannabis use or drinking alcohol. And we helped folks understand what their messaging that they learned around that, as opposed to suspension or expulsion, because they do get expelled on the college level. And we also, what else did we do there? One of the larger bodies of work that I did do, I was the restorative justice coordinator for a community of 3,000 folks. So I had trained some of our peers to be some of the youth, some of our young leaders to be restorative justice facilitators with me, and so that they were seeing, so that they could be working with their peers whenever there was harm. So we did engage with restorative justice practices, specifically around racial harms. That was with the bulk of my, besides conduct, that was the other portion of my work, where I was engaging the community around racial harms and engaging the community and responding to those racial harms. Um, and training our administrative and professors what restorative justice principles look like, specifically around community agreements, around community building, while at the simultaneously helping them recognize how they are complicit in a system of racial biases and oppression and inequities. And so a lot of the work, I was at St. Mary's for 9 years, and that was the body of my work while I was there, as well as being an administrative hearing officer. We didn't ask this question, but one of the things I always like to bring up is that one of the challenges that we always had in higher education is because, as David had said, it's an inherently oppressive system, an inherently punitive system most of the time around student conduct, was that we had to shift the way they thought about accountability. All right, because accountability tends to sound like that you are wrong, that you've committed that wrong. And so we had to shift that focus for folks, and we had to shift that punitive, because people ultimately wanted someone to still held onto that punitive kind of praxis and thought process and mentality. And so that was one of my biggest challenge. And the other was in higher education specifically. I don't know how it is in K through 12, because I've not worked in that environment or that population, was that folks wanted to have an alternative. And I guess this is kind of like a warning in after school programs. And if you're going to do conduct, or if you're going to deal with discipline, is they would offer students, you can either go through the hearing process, which is our punitive process, or you can do a restorative process. And so I worked to shift that we do the restorative process first, with the understanding that the punitive wasn't necessarily off the table. However, we're going to try this process first so that we can address the harm that's been caused, as opposed to going through a traditional hearing process. And I encourage practitioners who are going to do anything around disciplining students of whatever demographic that may be, to not say it's either this or that, because they're going to pick where it takes away from the spirit of somebody being willing, right? Because if you're going to be written up, you rather not be written up or have a record. So you rather not have the record, right? And so that was just some challenge that I wanted to voice, because I think that that's something that should be thought of. And so one of the things, let me think, what else did we do? One of the things that we looked at I talked about our resident directors or resident advisors who worked with students. We worked with them to build a restorative lens when they're working with their population of residents. And one of the pieces that we trained them on was how to manage and navigate conflict from a restorative justice lens. So they used to have roommate conflicts and things along those lines. And we helped them facilitate those conversations from a restorative justice practice and principles. And it actually helped diminish and decrease the number of roommate conflicts and people having to move. Our story circles and the process of using a restorative justice practice for hearing and discipline actually decreased our decreased recidivism. So folks weren't coming through our system as much. What we found is that 30 to 40% of those students were no longer coming in contact with our office, that we were decreasing the number of suspensions and expulsions for students. And so we were able to have those students, move those students into the pathways where they were being part of the community and being responsible to the community, as opposed to coming through our office once again. That's where I'm at with how it showed up, and those are the youth. Is there any other question? I think I have other things. The partners that I had listed, I couldn't do the work all by myself, so I worked closely with the University of California at Berkeley's Restorative Justice Center. I worked with them. I actually was a contract person with them, and so I worked within their community as well. As a restorative justice facilitator, we did a lot of trainings of the administrative staff, different departments, and how to do community building, how to have community agreements, what it meant to engage with their student population from a restorative justice lens. Circles for Social Change, I did some work with them outside of the university, but for the most part, they would come in and they would support. Because of the dynamic, when we start talking about responding to racial harms, because of my role in the organization and the institution I worked at, as a hearing officer, I asked for their outside help a lot of the times to facilitate circles and facilitate any work around restorative justice. So I was more or less organizing and creating some trainings, but I was also allowing for those groups to come in and help us navigate that, navigate any issues that we had. And the curriculum that I used for training, the resident directors training, I created that curriculum based on the trainings that I had received from different trainings and certifications I received from different organizations. And it's, for some reason, it's not at the top of my head which one I went to. Then I also use curriculum that existed, right? Like the very foundations of RJ. I think that if you have been through any type of training, have any type of experience with restorative justice, it's pretty much the same. It's not going to differ very much. It's going to be pretty much the same. And then I did create a curriculum around restorative justice responses to racial harms, because that was the bulk of my work that I did outside of conduct in my community. And then I'm looking at the questions they're asking me about what were some of the resources that I would recommend for after-school programs. I've not worked closely with RJoy, but I know that RJoy in Oakland is very respected and they do amazing work with the Oakland Unified School District that I'm aware of, and within Oakland. And then the Circles for Social Change for staff, because I think that staff, as David had mentioned, the children are going to, when you teach them and you show them and they are engaged and they are thought partners with their community and what their community gets to look like, and they get to imagine what their community look like and put that into action, we kind of bump up against adults that have their preconceived ideas of what that looks like and their own experiences. And so I think that one of the things that needs to happen, and when it's happened in my experience, is that while simultaneously creating this response to harms on our campus, just focusing on the students, we needed to focus on the adults as well. And so one of the things that we aimed to do was to have the professors and administrators understand what community building is, what restorative justice practices are, and so that they are on board with that, so they understand the language. Currently at the YMCA of San Francisco, even though I'm the director of GDEI, I'm incorporating restorative justice into the work that I do there, specifically with our employee resource groups And we also offering to other staff how to build their restorative justice lens, specifically around community building. That's where we're at right now. I've been at the Y for 1 year almost, and we're right now trying to get that capacity building and understanding what community agreements are and what a restorative justice lens can look like and how that what it feels like. And most of the folks that I'm working with now have to do with our youth development programs and our after school programs, but it's mostly, we're at the beginning of our journey, and that beginning for us is community building and community agreement so that we can practice what it means to be in relationship with one another, as opposed to from a restorative lens, from an equity lens. Yeah, that's all I have no presentation for you all.
We do have a few minutes before we go to our next panelist, but yeah, if folks have questions they want to throw in the chat, feel free.
I see a question of how do you start a story circle and what's the process? So the way that we had started a story circle was that we used the format for circles for any type of circle, right? Because in circles, there are different rounds. And so we started off by creating, letting folks know that it was voluntary, that they could be there if they wanted to, they didn't have to be. That the second thing is the way that you design it is like with any circle, you think about the community or the group that you're going to be working with, and then that's how you design your circles. And we started off by what we were trying to do with the story circles is we were trying to get folks comfortable telling stories about themselves. And so every question that we asked them, every prompt that we had was about, tell me a story about how you came about, how you learned your values, right? Like we started off with a value conversation. Then we started off with something easy, right? Like you get that kind of warm up. What is your weather? What type of weather do you feel like today? And then we move into values and shared values, and then we move into having conversations. So we usually had about 4 or 5 rounds, and those rounds we would have a talking piece like any other circle, but every question would be formed and tell a story about a time. Tell a story about a time when somebody responded to you in a way that felt like restoratively, or they spoke to you in a way that felt like empathy. And so I can share, I think I have some of that still around. I can share that outline and that script with you folks later. But yeah, that's how we started Story Circles. They're really effective. Students opened up a lot more than I thought that they would, because they were in a room with folks that they never necessarily came into contact with. And it wasn't as if they were in the same class. It wasn't as if they were in the same residence hall. They just were random folks from the community that came together to tell stories about their values and how they learned about their messaging around alcohol and cannabis use. I will put a website for our Joy in there. Somebody asked about that.
Questions for Victoria before we move on?
Ooh. Oh, ooh.
David's coming in hot.
Yeah, yeah.
I love it. This is
Yeah,
great.
Interesting. The question is, how do you shift that hierarchical system to a community without losing the responsibility of each person? How do you make them accountable for their actions? I think that was probably one of my biggest challenge, right? Because my colleagues always wanted that. How do you hold people accountable for their actions? And one of the things that I found to be amazing is that when I would use because prior to using restorative justice practices and questions in my interviews with students, and I would go the typical punitive route. You did this thing, here's the report, this is what's going to happen. This is what I think happened. When I moved from that to, hey, this situation happened, let's talk about it. So tell me what happened. Tell me what you were feeling. What I found is that students would willingly tell me that they did these things. And in that conversation, we would work together and how to get them the resources. Because typically when students are acting out in that way, specifically in college, in that 18 to 22-year-old group, it's usually something going on with their personal life, something going on, some kind of fear, some kind of anxiety. And that's the human-centered. That's why, for me, restorative justice is human-centered, because we go underneath the behavior and we look at that person and what are you going through? What is happening for you? And I would typically, they would tell me the truth. And so I would give them we would work to get the resources that they need for support, as opposed to them being, here's these different sanctions that you have to, I had to use that language, right? I had to use that language for the purposes of the college, but I usually didn't find those students to be responsible in the technical way. I tried to get them the support that they needed so that they could figure out different ways to navigate and negotiate the feelings that they were having. So for me, I tried to stay away from finding somebody, making them take responsibility and accountability. The accountability was, I'm willing to recognize that I caused some harm to my community, and I'm willing to make those things right. And that's the accountability. The responsibility part of it, to me, is language that comes from a punitive system that is meant to have greater harm to that student. And so when I worked with students, it was, you're accountable. And then I think that the trick is, and what folks up here, Nellie and David, are talking about, when you understand when you have community agreements, you already are responsible to that community. When you have that way of being in relationship to one another, you already have responsibility to that community. So I hope that answered your question. Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for asking that question.
Thank you. Nellie, you had your hand up, but we have time.
Well, Victoria kind of covered part of what I wanted to say. I think that's why there's a foundation that has to be built. You don't just, at least in our experience and all the training we've attended, is that, part of that community building is understanding that there are rights and responsibilities in a circle that we share, that we all share. And then when you get to that, when you build that foundation, by the time you get to the kind of problem, you've built enough trust and safety that you can engage in conflict resolution or problem solving. There's usually a protocol that's built into those agreements. And I think Victoria shared an example of those 5 questions that most of us are probably using if we're doing this work. And I guess the 4th or 5th question is addressing what was the harm done from your perspective and what are you willing to do to repair that harm, which is kind of connected to what David shared about I think it's relate. What was it 3, David? The last one was repair, but it's
relate, repair, restore.
Relate, repair, restore. So before you can get to restore it, so I feel like there is definitely, it doesn't happen automatically. I think it's built, and it's, like David said, it's a culture shift. We live in a very individualistic culture. So we're really going against the grain of society, let alone all of the other systemic issues. There's one thing I wanted to mention, that it's nice to hear folks from the West Coast talk about a lot of these issues freely. In Florida, we're doing this work with a lot of, for want of a better expression, a lot of constraints. And so we often have to use different language to do the same work. We use the language of inclusion, but there's a lot of what was mentioned that we now, there's a lot of ambiguity about what can be said in public spaces. And especially when working with after-school programs in the school district. So for instance, you heard me say we used we used to say social emotional learning initiative. As of this year, their well-being and life skills initiative built around the state of Florida's new resiliency and life skills standards. So, you know, so I just wanted to point that out because I don't know who's going to be listening, because your reality may look more like ours, where you have to find ways to do restorative, to integrate restorative practice called by a different name, or in a way that is kind of aligned with the reality that the context that you're in, both the political and the cultural context.
Thank you, Nellie. Appreciate that. Thank you again to Victoria for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us and what it looks like the post-high school experience. So that's definitely an insight I know I didn't have. So grateful to hear that that work is being done as well. So I'm gonna give you some virtual snaps as well. Thank you, Victoria. Our next speaker is Stephanie Medley, Director of Youth Justice at Rise Youth Center, and that's RYSE, Rise. Stephanie Medley has been part of the Rise team since 2012 and now acts as the Director of Education and Justice. As Director of Education and Justice, Stephanie leads program development and advocacy and cultivates cross-sector collaborations to address the needs of youth and young adults impacted by education, economic, and criminal and juvenile justice systems. Stephanie is passionate about supporting the development and coordination of youth-friendly and culturally appropriate policies, practices, and supports. She works to create avenues for young people to navigate their own liberation and transform systems. Welcome, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. Gosh, I'm kind of like David. I want to say everything that everybody else said. Is what we do. So I'm so appreciative of being in this space with everyone, hearing the different programs that we've heard so far. Thank you, Nellie, for the grounding. I appreciate that very much because I was not grounded this morning. So bear with me, my allergies are acting up. So it's been a pretty rough morning. But thank you for inviting me to talk a little bit about our program at Rise. I did want to start with a few quotes because I really think that it speaks to how we practice restorative practices at Rise. The first quote is from Rumi: "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there." The next quote is from Joan Baez: "That's all nonviolence is, organized love." And this next quote: "Young people are in pain. What do they need? They need love, so be love." So that quote is from one of our former members, one of our former youth members, one of our former staff members, and now he's a beautiful poet. If you've ever checked out the web series, The North Pole, he's one of the actors on that as well. But when it comes to the work that we're doing at Rise, we really try to figure out how are we always showing love to our young people, and how are we creating a beloved community. I want to touch on a couple of different things because some of the things that Nellie brought up, some of the things that David brought up, and Victoria are some of the practices that we have at Rise. And when we're looking at restorative practices at Rise, they show up in a few different ways. One is through nonviolent communication. One is through circle process, and then also through our restorative justice diversion program. So I'll actually start with that because when I initially came to Rise, that was like my main focus, was to bring a restorative justice diversion program to Contra Costa County. And it was a very tough thing to bring to Contra Costa County, but we were finally able to do that and start a program in 2020, right as the pandemic was starting. But that particular program looks at young people that have been impacted by the criminal legal system. And it's a pre-charge program that gets referrals from the DA's office, and we focus on high-level misdemeanors, low-level felonies, and completely diverts young people from the traditional criminal legal system. That work is important for us, and I wanted to kind of start off with that because I'm originally from Richmond, where RISE is located. And so that work was important for me because I've seen so many friends, family, loved ones impacted by the criminal legal system. So many of our young people at RISE are impacted by the criminal legal system. And so being able to bring that kind of level of change and transformation, even though there's still a lot to do, was very important. So when we're looking at our restorative justice diversion program, we're really looking at acknowledging that we're all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And we're encouraging how a constructive community-based response to a wrongdoing can happen. And also, we're giving back people's voices. In the traditional criminal legal system, the survivor or the person harmed, they don't really have a voice. And so we're creating a way so everyone that has been impacted by a wrongdoing can have a voice and figure out through this healthy struggle, how do we create a space that allows for healing, and how are we rebuilding relationship? And that includes everyone in the community. Just a little bit about that program. Once it gets to RISE, once it's referred to RISE, law enforcement is completely out of the picture. And it's a RISE case. And so it's a really beautiful process where the young person is able to be accountable for whatever wrong that they've done. The person harmed is able to talk about the impact. And we kind of see like this beautiful transformation happen with everybody that's involved in the process. And I wanted to start that off because safety is a huge, I think, conversation in the community and in many of our communities, and what safety looks like. And so we're constantly trying to get people's view of what safety means to shift. And we do that with our restorative practices. RISE was born out of the advocacy and organization and organizing of young people. And so we kind of keep that same energy up with everything that we do. So when we talk about like what safety is, we're committed. So all of our young people, our partners, our visitors to RISE, our staff feel comfortable and confident with being themselves while broadening their horizons. And so when we're defining our restorative practices, we're looking at the emotional, political, physical safety of everyone that we come in contact with and what we're doing. We try to be flexible and adaptive to the needs of our young people. And we try to create a predictable and loving environment guided and grounded by our vision, values, and our house agreements. So when we're looking at how do we create this space, we're really looking at how are we creating a healing-centered space. And when we're thinking about healing-centered, we're looking at an asset-based and culturally rooted approach to healing and well-being for young people of color and their adult allies. We look at it as being explicitly political. We look at it as being culturally grounded and views healing as the restoration of identity. We look at being asset driven and focusing on the well-being that we want, not only the symptoms we want to suppress. We look at it as being supportive practitioners and paying attention to our own healing. And we're asking young people, our partners, who are you? What's right with you? And what's right with your community? A lot of times our our communities are viewed in a deficit based. And so we're really trying to switch that around and look at what are the assets, what's the expertise that our communities have, and how do we create systems and practices to ensure that we're all safe within that. So a little bit about nonviolent communication, because it is one of the aspects that we practice here at RISE. And so nonviolent communication for us, it's an approach to communication based on principles of nonviolence. It's not necessarily a technique to end disagreements, but it's a method designed to increase empathy and to improve the quality of life for those who utilize the method and the people around them. So some of the key components of that is that all human beings have a range of universal needs. All actions and behaviors are attempts to meet those needs. The strategies that we use to meet those needs may differ from person to person because we're meeting people where they are. And strategy is where conflict lives. And so we not only apply this when we're working with our young people and helping them, supporting them in how they're working through things, whether it's with staff or with their peers, but we also apply the strategy to how we work with our partners, whether it's at the county meetings, whether it's at some of the different boards that directors sit on. But we do this because we want to make sure that people realize it's not just about putting the onus on young people to do something, but as adults, we also have to practice what we're preaching as well. And so we utilize these approaches when I use it all the time in a lot of the different county meetings that I'm in, to show that, you know, it actually can work. It can spark dialogue and meaningful dialogue. And it may take a little bit longer, but we can move through this process together in community.
Stephanie, there was a question in the chat about whether you involved parents or families in the process as well.
Yeah, depending on what the specific incident is or what's going on, we do involve parents and families in the process. And it can look a number of different ways. When it's some of our members at RISE that are going through something, it may sometimes just be a phone call to the parents. Sometimes it may be the parents coming in to participate in a circle. When we're looking at our restorative justice diversion program, we always have parents that are the parents of the responsible youth or their guardian or another trusted adult that they have participate in the ultimate circle that we do. Sometimes the person that's been harmed in our restorative justice diversion program can be a young person that's been harmed. And so if it is a young person, we also have their parents or guardian participate in that process as well. And, you know, just so you kind of have a little bit of context, that diversion program, the process can take between like 6 to 10 months, sometimes longer. It's not like, oh, we're just going to have this circle in a few weeks. A lot of prep goes into that process. A lot of things come out of that process where we figure out that there's some root needs that need to be addressed before we can even get to the ultimate circle. And sometimes that happens as well with conflicts that arise at RISE. Hope that answered the question. Another thing that I wanted to touch on too is, and this was directly from our young people, because they felt that sometimes when we were like, okay, well, we got to circle up or do something, is that it was always happening when there was something wrong. And so we really did not want them to associate restorative practices with, okay, if something bad happens, that's when we're circling up. When there's been a critical incident in the community, we're having a grief circle. And so one of the things that we did start implementing is how do we implement celebratory circles within our system. So it's not always associated with a wrongdoing or something that's sad. And that looks a number of different ways. Sometimes it may just be doing a community builder together. It looks like having birthday circles to celebrate different people in the center. Or it looks like graduation circles to celebrate our graduates that are moving into being a freshman in high school, or our senior graduates that are moving into being graduate or being freshmen in college. And so really, assessing and attuning and kind of coordinating, we need to change things up a little bit was important for us to make sure that we have that buy-in from young people on the process that we do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, it's the practice of being in that space, right? So that it isn't this sense of urgency of something negative all the time. I appreciate you naming that for sure. We have time for a few questions if folks want to throw them in the chat or unmute themselves and ask. I actually had a question, was gonna wait, but I'll ask it while I can. Again, I don't know if I caught it or not, but the process, the partnerships that you have. I heard some of it is with the school district or within schools, yes, and then I also heard like a situation would get handed off over to you from I forgot what
The
that
district
was.
attorney.
Oh, from the district attorney. Got it. What other partners do you work with or are at service to?
So we don't formally work with the school district,
Okay.
but the school district does call on us a lot for especially when different incidents happen within the community. And we've trained them on numerous different things. So we kind of informally do work with the school district. When we're called on, we'll show up as needed. We do receive referrals from the district attorney's office for our diversion program. Other partners, I mean, especially with our diversion program, one of the components for that is bringing in community for those particular cases, and that can look different if it's involving any type of sexual violence. We may call in a specific partner for that. And so we're always continuously building our partnerships with different organizations, and not just organizations, but folks in the community that are living in the community. They're if they're open to participating in a circle with us, then we work with them and prep them for what that looks like to participate in the circle.
Thank you. We have time for another question. Guess we'll wait till the Q&A, so don't leave us, Stephanie, just in case. So thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate you and your expertise and your time and for sharing that with us. Definitely want to give you some virtual snaps as well. Our last panelist for today is Dr. Kamoya Johnson from RJOY, who you've heard the name pop up already. RJOY is the Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. Kamoya Johnson is an experienced trainer, curriculum designer, and restorative justice conflict resolution practitioner in the Bay Area since 2006. Currently, Dr. Johnson is the director with Restorative Justice for Oakland, RJOY, as well as the lead trainer for SEEDS, Conflict Resolution Center, and co-trainer, mentor, and coach for UC Berkeley Restorative Justice Center. In addition to restorative justice and conflict resolution skills, Dr. Johnson is trained in nonviolent communication, behavior analysis, case management, and coaching for equity. Welcome, Dr. Kamoya Johnson.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I too would like to just ditto everything that's been said thus far. I also have my colleague on here, Kyle McClurkins, so I will be handing it off to him as well to say a little bit and just introduce himself. But before I do that, I'm just going to introduce myself. So I'm Dr. Kamoya Johnson. I have been with RJOY for almost 3 years now. Prior to that, I was with Oakland Unified for almost 20 years. And I've been working in education in various capacities for over 25 years, restorative justice practitioner for over 17 years. And I've worked with young people in the educational system through higher education, and young people and adults, young adults, old adults, all of the adults who hold the environment as well, and families and community. And so I'll hand it over to Kyle to introduce himself as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle McClurkins. I also work with RJOY. This is going to my second year as RJOY, formerly a restorative practice facilitator with OUSD for about 12 years, working with grades level 3 through 12. Currently, I'm at Rudsdale High School, Continuation School, and Councilmont High School in Oakland. Facilitate, definitely recently been facilitating a lot of Black girl groups, specifically because there was a lot of, I think 80% of suspensions were from 9th and 10th grade African-American girls. So definitely been partnering with them and Youth Uprising, just for a space and having twice a week circles for about an hour, just building community. I feel not specific on what person said it, but we don't want it to always be about, oh, we're only going to gather when there's a whole community building circle so everyone can get to know each other. That way our baby humans will be better off in the world and in community with each other.
Thank you so much, Kyle. So I'm just going to start off a little bit just about Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, RJOY. We are an organization located now in downtown Oakland on Broadway, 17th and Broadway. So feel free to come by and say hi to us. This is our new location. We were at Filbert for a while and Preservation Park prior to that, if you're familiar with Oakland. And so what we do is we offer trainings globally, coaching as well, our community trainings. You may see some flyers if you want to be on our mailing list to come to that. You're more than welcome. Those trainings are currently free, sponsored by RJOY and ACBH, Behavioral Health, Alameda County Behavioral Health. And so we encourage folks to come through, participate in those trainings. We offer community building trainings which is the foundation, as we've heard from various folks who have spoke thus far. Community building is the foundation. Without community building, what are we restoring back to? We also offer harm and conflict trainings, as well as circles of support and accountability. And we offer coaching for organizations, school districts, all over. We have a global education platform or process that we do as well. We just got back from Ghana, where we went to the incarceral systems there, and we learned how do they be with each other? What does relationship look like there? As well as the, I'm blanking on the name, but it's mediation process there. When communities have conflict, and conflict is normal, it just means we have a difference of opinion, but it can get huge if we don't deal with that small conflict. And so we learned how do they bring folks together voluntarily, so that they can talk about what's going on and then come up with a solution that works for them. And so they're not telling them what to do, but they're working with them and just giving them language on how to be and hear each other when they're together. And so that's very, very important for us. Prior to that, our Joy went to South Africa, where they also learned, sat with different communities and learned how to be. And so that education is very important as we expand our thinking on how to be with each other. How do we sit in circle space? What does that mean for us as a community? What does that mean for us when we all have our different perspectives and experiences coming in, and now we're together? And so having that intentional conversation around what do we need to be with each other? And we want to do that actually before conflict happens. And so when conflict does arise, now we have a platform that we can actually have the conversation, and people can lean into that discomfort of having that conversation. And so that helps us expand thinking as we travel around the globe and just listen to different folks and how they be with each other, regardless of the conflict that has occurred. We also have community support. So we have a program called Safe Outside the Systems, and it's a warm line, and it's a line that anyone can call if they are currently in conflict, or if they don't want to call the police if there's no immediate danger. And so if I'm in a family and my family is having conflict, it may escalate. I can call this warm line. Someone has a phone, they will answer, and then they will triage, they will listen. And then we also partner with other folks to give services so that we can give a holistic wraparound service to anyone. And when I mean anyone, I mean anyone. Young people, adults, families, communities. We want to partner with everybody in the community so that the next generation can come into a different way of being. And so we're very intentional, the work that we do in communities. We want to make it accessible to everyone in the community. And that includes the school district. So we also partner with Oakland Unified School District. Teachers can reach out, families can reach out, young people can reach out, even if it's just to have a listening ear. There's somebody who can go through that restorative conversation with them. There's someone who can also call families and kind of de-escalate if things are kind of heavy at home or in the community. And so that's the work that we do. We also hold circles. So circles is that maintenance piece. Because we are a community-based organization and we're not in schools, we have various people who come through our circles. And we have a set population as well. And so our circles are always open to folks to come, get what they need, continue to come, or just come for a short while. We have Black male circles, we have Black women's circles, we have Sister Cipher, which is a circle for female and femme identified people of color. We have Cutie Pock, which is a circle for queer, trans, and people of color. We have Freedom Circles, as a circle for folks who have been formerly incarcerated and their supporters. We also have youth circles. So we have our youth program, young people ages 16 to 25 who we train to hold space. They sit in space, they experience space, they go and visit other organizations who hold restorative justice circles with various types of folks in the carceral system, in the community, as we heard previously. And they're learning how to hold space with their peers as well as others. And I heard a lot of that generational, what I call generational support. And so working with folks in higher education, working with folks in community, working with folks in the carceral system, we are now creating a generation where they're going out into the community and they're going to do things differently because now they have this skill set to do things differently. And this is how we sustain being in positive relationship. We're creating environments now that those folks are going out and holding a space, whether it's their own family, whether they're working in the educational system, in organizations, they're creating an environment that is now a restorative environment. And so when conflict happens, again, conflict is normal. Now they have different tools on how to deal with that conflict. So we're less likely to get those folks being incarcerated because of a behavior or because they didn't have the skill set or the language or the experience to deal with their situation differently. I'm going to pause and let Kyle jump in to talk about the work that he's doing in schools.
Thanks, Kamoya. So I would like to highlight a couple of positives. One, when we're running these circles in the schools, definitely breaking bread is super important. So there's always food. That's the buy-in that I love to use. It's always voluntary as well. So at Rudgedale, they have I don't like to use the word newcomer, I'm gonna say international students. We have a lot of international students that are coming in from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. So from there, some of my circles have definitely been all in Spanish. So there's an elective that I can do after school, and I pay my students a stipend because a lot of students, are looking for work, but this gives them an incentive to come to a circle and receive a compensation. Usually about an hour and a half long, and they learn restorative practices, and we do it all in Spanish. Now, is my Spanish muy excelente? Hell no, but I work on it, and I practice every day, and I learn new words. I don't use any English, so sometimes I use my Google Translate. Sometimes I may even have to use a student who does speak English and can translate for me. So I'm doing that adult youth partnership to be that vessel. And it was a super great group. I ended up with 12 students, and they all completed it, and they all got paid. And they're looking forward to it this year as well. It's only 6 weeks, but it was really good. Once a week, every Wednesday after school. Great elective. And as far as my African-American girl group, same thing as far as always having food, making sure they get compensated and they're learning, and they can also facilitate circles at the end. So like my international students can facilitate circles with their families or their friends, and the students who are at Council Mom, the African-American girls, can facilitate circles and reduce the conflicts around anything that may happen. But we definitely want to work about community building. So those are definitely some highlights that have happened between the two schools. And I look forward to doing more work with these two schools this week and this year, and just increasing the capacity and having more students jump on.
Thank you, Kyle. And yeah, I would just like to reiterate the fact that our young people are employed. And so that's huge when partnering with young people. It's been my experience. Like I said, I've been over 25 years working in education. It's been my experience that young people will listen to young people before they will listen to older folks. And so when we can employ our young people to go in and hold the space, that's phenomenal. That's absolutely phenomenal. All of our circles as well, all of our circle participants in all of our circles, they get $10 per circle. So every 10 circles, we send them a $100 gift card. And so that's our appreciation. Thank you for taking the time out to be in positive community. And again, it's all about instilling those skill sets so that when they have their families, when they go out into their work environment, when they go out into community, now they are bringing that with them. The skill set doesn't leave because they leave the circle. We have steeped them in the restorative justice process. And so they're less likely to make that negative choice that's going to send them down a path that isn't the best. They're more likely to increase and say, oh, wait a minute, I have the skill set to have this conversation. It's a difficult conversation, but I'm going to be brave and lean into this discomfort and have this conversation. And so that's where we want our adults, that's where we want our young people to be. Within our youth program, we just piloted a middle school component where we had 11 through 15 in two different groups. So we had 11 to 13 and then 14 and 15-year-olds, because our year-round program is for 16 to 25. And that's intentional. We can pay them, they're employed. Middle schoolers, we cannot employ during the school year. And so we wanted something that was going to allow younger people to actually access this. And I know one of the questions was like, what age can we do restorative justice? We can start at any age. I have a grandbaby. She is 7 months today, I think. And, I'm doing that restorative justice. Her father, her mother, we're engulfing her in restorative justice. And so when she starts to speak, she can also have that skill. And so we can start at any age to hold a restorative justice space. And they will absorb all of that, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. And that's where we want to give folks a chance to have this skill set to be and move through the world in a different way, so that conflict doesn't become this thing that's now this huge thing where people like me get called in and RJoy gets called in to now help resolve this. This is what we want the world to look like. So I'm gonna stop there. Are there any questions? Oh, one more thing, I just forgot. So now we are going into the juvenile justice system. We are working with young people in there as well, holding space, having restorative conversations, bringing in resources for those young people when they are re-entering back into society. How can we help support them to make a different decision as well? And we have for all employees and our young people and our partners, we have a house in Jackson, California, where people can go. We can steward the land. We have raised flower beds. We can steward the land. We're growing our own food. And young people, when they go there, no matter where they come from, they go there and they sit under the stars and they're like, wow, I cannot see stars where I live. And so just being in that environment, removing them from the city life and being in the country life has just been so peaceful. And even for adults, just rejuvenating ourselves. I know there was talk about the self-work that we have to do in holding restorative justice. And so we have to be kind to ourselves. We have to give ourselves grace. We have to, and while we are continuing to build our skill set in being with each other. And what does that look like? That means pouring back into us as well, holding those spaces for us as well. In our organization, we hold spaces for each other. We can do circles of support for each other. We do that. We do that for our young people. We hold our staff meetings. And so that's being and doing, consistently being and doing is actually how you sustain that restorative justice environment. We cannot say, oh, we're doing this for other people while we're gonna not, sit in space and move into and lean into that discomfort when it affects us. No, we have to be able to lean into that discomfort when it affects us, because we are the model. We're modeling for other people. It can't just be talk. We have to be able to do it, and that includes our young people. Some people say, "Well, I want to learn this practice so that my young people can act better." Well, it starts with you, right? How are you actually building your skill set, showing up differently so that the young people can see you showing up differently? Now we can have that conversation with that young person. What do they need? Because they may need something that different, right? Each young person may need something different, just like each adult needs something different to show up. And so how are we shifting ourselves and practicing with ourselves, practicing with our colleagues so that we can come in and be and do with our young people? And it's a true partnership then. All voice and choice is equal in the space. Now, as adults, we are charged with holding a safe environment. So there are some non-negotiables that have to enter into the space, especially in the educational system, working in K-12. There are some non-negotiables, but does everything have to be a non-negotiable? And that's where the conversation enters with your young people. Well, these are some things that I'm thinking about. What are your thoughts? And that conversation can happen in circle. And now you don't have to circle up for everything, but even projects. How are you creating projects? I do art in my circles. So doing artwork, okay, let's share out in circle. What does this mean to you? What did you hear from others? Always connecting the skill set that they're building in the circle space to the outer community. Always. And now you're bringing it from the unconsciousness to the consciousness. And they're more likely to now have that knee-jerk reaction that's actually a conscious behavior versus an unconscious one that now happens when emotions are high. Right. So any thoughts or questions? Yes, the warm line is available for everyone. I can get that information over to Johanna, and she can send that out to everyone.
Absolutely. Any resources our panelists have for us today, we will make sure it is shared when the webinar is made available. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kamoya Johnson, and to Kyle. Thank you for sharing the highlights of the work that you're doing and the progress that you're making. Beautiful. Appreciate all of that. Virtual snaps to you all. Wanted to go ahead and open it up to everybody in the chat box for Q&A. Any questions that have now surfaced now that we've heard from everybody? Well, folks are still thinking. Wanted to open it up to any of our panelists if you had any final thoughts, any final things that you wanted to share with us as we continue with the Q&A. I'll go ahead and read out Victoria's question here. So how do you incorporate RJ into a program that is not dedicated to that and in a way that is actually effective and does not cause more harm? And our panelists want to address that.
I would just say one circle at a time, leveraging the relationships that you slowly build, working with the early adopters first, and then, of that community, and then slowly working with them, and when it comes to restorative justice in a system that doesn't support it, it's about experience, because experience precedes belief often with something like this. And you can read about it, watch videos, but until you actually are in it, you're not going to really understand what it is. And so this is not a plug and play kind of thing. It has to be artisanally designed for every ecosystem that it's in, and you just got to do it slowly. It's not on a it's very different than what we're used to, and it's not based on, like numbers and linear ways of being. It's a something that takes time, and every system that it's in is going to take its own time. And so you meet the system where it's at, or the community where they're at, and you move from there. So it's not impossible to incorporate RJ into a system that's not RJ, but it just takes time. That's my thoughts about that.
Thank you, David. Another comment, segueing into a question, is there's a lot of experiences shared here about middle and high school youth. Do any of our panelists have any experience with regards to elementary age students, or how is it different in after school spaces?
Yes, I'll just jump in. Yes, I spent a lot of time with the little ones, and in after school spaces with the little ones, I would say that I like to do a lot of movement, as well as with my middle and high school and adults, actually. The body just needs to move. And so with young people, I do a lot of movement. Our activities, especially when I go in because or I have went in because there was conflict happening. And so immediately I'm going in and I'm partnering. I'm doing a little observation, and then I'm partnering with the young people, giving them like little pieces. Oh, I have this, that ball that expands and goes out. Okay, would you like to lead a quick little 3-breath breathing? Let me show you how it works. The singing bowl, having them show them how it works. And so, and then doing activities that then either unmask or can address what's going on. And if you're just going in just for community building, now you're doing activities that still gets to the heart of it, because oftentimes we're not attuned to those conflicts until it becomes in our face. But the young people feel it, they breathe it, they experience it every day. And so as adults, to heighten our attunement actually is through the young person's eyes. And that's where the partnership is so valuable. I've sat in spaces where I've held circles with kindergartners, first graders. They are phenomenal circle leaders. They are phenomenal circle participants. They can sit and they can listen to their peers. We have to build the capacity though. And so if our expectation is that everybody's going to enter into space and they're not going to say a peep until that talking piece is passed around, then that's not a realistic expectation. And so we have to have realistic expectations for the developmental level that they're at, and not necessarily the age that they're at. And so when I say developmental and not age, a 5-year-old could be at a higher developmental, thinking level, or a younger developmental thinking level. It's just the skill set, and how are we building that skill set as a community? And that's having that conversation. What do they need? I see a friend that's struggling. What are some ways that we can help them? And you pass around that talking piece. What are some things that you're struggling with? Let's pass around that talking piece. They are phenomenal at that.
Thank you, Kamoya. Nellie, you had your hand up.
Yes, and in listening to Kamoya, I've half forgotten the whole question, but I'll just share what was on top of mind. So there are a few things that come up when we do this. So Primetime works primarily with elementary aged children in both district-based after-school programs and community-based programs. So there are multiple factors, especially in district-based sites, that can cause constraints, like literally even being able to form a circle with the furniture that's there, being able to rely on the same space every day, feeling safe there, being able to have, we like to tell them, put your your circle agreements up on the wall. Sometimes they can't even do that. So understanding, getting back to the essence of what we were talking about. Well, what is restorative practice? What is it really about? And the essence, I think, is really understanding what that trust means. The trust is not just about feeling comfortable to say things in front of each other. The trust is bidirectional. It's also the adult trusting that the young person, regardless of their age, has the power to awaken to what they need, and has the power and has the wherewithal to express that, and that we can empower young people at any age to do that if we create a safe and brave environment where that can happen. The other thing that I'll say is that, sometimes people walk into these practitioners may have concerns about, or maybe a little bit impatient with behavior management, and they think that the purpose of the circle is to discipline young people. And so there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen for the adult and for the children, because we don't know what they're going home to. So there was oftentimes we're taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so we also have to be patient in that process about, and of course we in the training and whatnot, we do talk about, and we do train them on how to shift from the mindset of discipline, quote unquote discipline, to to understanding that behavior is the language of needs, like what was mentioned about nonviolent communication, right? And so it goes back to, kind of what is the foundation? What is it that we're really doing? We're creating a shift in culture. We're having to be and relate to each other with a different mindset, with a different heart set. And that requires sometimes vulnerability. And so one of the things that I have learned from working directly with after-school programs is, we create a container, we create some tools, but then we also allow them to customize around what their needs are. And so what I, as a coach, as a trainer, and also as a program designer, try to instill is that you can make it your own, you can trust yourself, and there is nothing wrong with practicing with youth. When you sit to do a mindfulness practice, you're self-regulating with them. and let them know that, because then it becomes just about the human experience, and it's not about the hierarchy. It's not about me passing on something to you, because a child may be more awakened than an adult in that circle. And so we have to be open to the possibility that a young person may say something that causes us to wake up to something we didn't even notice before. So that's like a whole other level. But I think that it comes down to this culture shift that we've all been talking about, which is that, you know, we're individuals, but we're also, when we sit in that circle, we're a community. And in that community, we're all equal. We're all showing up equal. So thank you.
Thank you, Nellie. There was another question in the chat about if it was possible to have time limits for a circle. I see some nodding.
I can answer that. I think that as we're designing circles, we have to take that into consideration. However, I agree with what David's saying. It can't be plug and play. And so when I engage with circle work with folks or any restorative practice, I always let them know, like, if like, hey, Victoria, we only want to do a 45-minute, this is all the time we have. Can you come to the staff meeting? And I'm like, oh, you're going to have to dedicate a little bit more time than that to this process. Because there's that specifically around community building and values and community agreements. And so I think that being mindful that this is not a plug and play, right? And doing the work in the beginning, right? Like I've broken it down into this week, we're going to talk about our values. Next week, we're going to talk about community building. And it's a process. And it's like Nellie was saying, we have to be patient. And then we have to model that patience too. And I think that being fully transparent about the process for people is going to help navigate when folks are like, can we do this in a lunch hour? Can we do this at our, our staff meeting or along those lines? Or we can only give you 45 minutes. So yes, you can put time limits. And I think that you can also put subject matter limits in there as well. Like, we're going to do this for 45 minutes. We're going to talk about, our values right now. That's how I've approached it in the past.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, thank you, Nellie. I saw that in the chat. That's the exact thing I was thinking. Accepting non-closure and ongoing deliberation, the shared agreement we have used to deal with not having enough time. That's absolutely part of this practice, sure. Because we always want to have that ribbon on the end. It's dealt with, I can walk away, and that's not always the case, for sure. So being very transparent in that, and I love that as a standing agreement that's present, for sure. We have time for one more question. If there's anything else that's coming up for our participants today. Well, I wanted to give an appreciation to Victoria Gonzalez. Thank you for answering the questions about the 5 questions that you had mentioned in practicing in circles. So I'll make sure that we save the chat so that information is saved for folks if they didn't get a chance to write them down. They are there if you want to access them still. Thank you, Anton. Anton says, thanks to all the panelists for sharing their very meaningful work that you're doing within our communities to embed RJ practices. Agreed. Thank you. Want to invite panelists, if you have any last minute thank yous, feel free to throw that in the chat. You can share an emoji to show your appreciation to our panelists for their experiences and their time and vulnerability as well with us. Appreciate you. So I'm just going to share my screen one last time. Make sure I'm on the right page. Okay. So wanted to share soon to be released a briefing paper, Restorative Justice Practices and After-School Programs, that will be provided through Temescal Associates and the How Kids Learn Foundation. See that resource there. And then also wanted to share where this webinar will be living. There are other webinars that have been provided and other topics that have been shared in terms of after-school spaces. So know that that resource is available to you as well. So we want to thank our panelists for their participation, to all of you for attending this webinar today. We're posting a recording of today's session, which can be shared with you and your colleagues. You can visit the How Kids Learn YouTube channel to watch past webinars and share with staff. Stay tuned for more informative and exciting webinars from Temescal Associates and the How Kids Learn Foundation. Much love to Sam for creating this space for all of us. Appreciate you and your ongoing work in supporting the out of school time field. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time. It's great to meet you all.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the day. Have a beautiful rest of the week.
Thank you.